Every conversation about character building focuses on what you gain, the resilience, the integrity, the depth that comes from having been tested and not broken. These are real, but they are the results, not the process. And the process is what most treatments of this subject quietly skip over, because the process is not inspiring. It is expensive, and the cost is not paid in effort or in time exactly. It is paid in something more personal than either. The Stoics were unusual in their willingness to be explicit about this. They did not sell character building as a path to happiness or success or the admiration of others. They described it as something closer to surgery, a painful, necessary correction of the self that, done well, leaves you more capable and less comfortable. They understood that the person who emerges from genuine character building is not simply a better version of the person who began it. They are, in certain important ways, a different person. And becoming a different person always costs you the one you were. The question is not whether the cost is worth it. The Stoics were clear that it was. The question is whether you know what you are actually agreeing to pay. Welcome to Logostoic. In today's video, we are going to examine what genuine character building actually costs, not the motivational version but the honest one. If content like this challenges how you think rather than simply confirming what you already believe, consider subscribing to Logostoic and turning on notifications. Now let's begin. Zeno of Citium, the man who would found Stoicism, arrived at his philosophy through shipwreck. He had been a prosperous merchant, carrying a cargo of purple dye from Phoenicia to Greece, when his ship went down and he lost everything. He made his way to Athens with nothing, and found himself in a bookseller's shop reading Xenophon's account of Socrates. He was so affected by what he read that he asked the bookseller where he could find men like this. The bookseller pointed to the philosopher crates passing in the street. Zeno followed him. What is striking about this story is not the drama of the shipwreck. It is what Zeno chose to do with the aftermath. He did not spend his energy reconstructing what he had lost. He did not treat the disaster as an interruption to be overcome so that he could return to the life he had before. He allowed it to redirect him entirely, toward philosophy, toward the slow, uncomfortable work of examining what a human life was actually for. The character building that followed was not a supplement to his real life. It replaced his real life. That is the first cost, the willingness to let the person you were go, because you have seen something that makes continuing to be that person impossible. Most people who speak about character building imagine it as an addition, something layered onto the existing self to make it stronger or more admirable. The Stoics understood it as a subtraction. What gets built is not added on top. It emerges through the removal of what was not real to begin with, the performed confidence, the borrowed opinions, the identity constructed from what other people expect rather than what you actually believe. That removal is not comfortable. It requires you to sit with a version of yourself that has been stripped of its usual protections, and to build from there rather than retreating to the familiar performance. The second cost is the one Seneca wrote about with unusual candor, the cost of separation. He described his own experience of living according to philosophical principles while surrounded by people who did not, the mockery that came not from enemies but from people who knew him, the social pressure to abandon what he was doing and return to the ordinary way of spending time and attention. He was not persecuted. He was simply made to feel that his choices were a judgment of theirs, which in a way they were. And the response of the people around him was what it almost always is when someone begins to live differently. They tried to pull him back. This is one of the least discussed costs of genuine character building, that it makes you strange. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in the small ways that accumulate into distance. You stop finding certain conversations satisfying. You stop wanting certain things that the people around you are organizing their lives to obtain. You develop a standard for your own behavior that others do not share and did not ask you to apply, and which your mere presence makes visible in a way that is uncomfortable for everyone. Seneca was precise about this. The person who is genuinely building character will lose some of the ease they had with certain kinds of company. This is not a side effect. It is an indication that something real is happening. The third cost is the most difficult to name because it operates in private, in the gap between what you know you should do and what you actually do. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this gap with an honesty that is almost painful to read. The Emperor of Rome, alone with a wax tablet, cataloging his own failures of nerve and consistency. He had access to every external resource that the ancient world could provide, and none of it closed the gap. The work of character building is interior, and it is never finished. and it requires you to keep returning to a confrontation with the distance between your stated values and your actual behavior. Not once, in a crisis, but daily, in the ordinary moments when no one is watching and the easier choice is available. This daily confrontation is expensive in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has not attempted it. It is not painful in the way that physical hardship is painful. It is the specific discomfort of holding yourself to a standard that you yourself have set, in conditions where no one is enforcing it, where giving yourself the exception would be easy and undetected and, in any individual case, entirely forgivable. The accumulation of those moments, the ones where you hold the standard and the ones where you don't, is what character actually is. Not the dramatic tests, though those matter too. The small, private, unwitnessed ones. What the Stoics offer on this is not encouragement exactly. It is clarity. They did not promise that character building would become easier over time, or that the cost would decrease as the character strengthened. What they observed was that the person who has genuinely built character carries the cost differently, not with less weight, but with more capacity. The discipline is still required. The confrontation with the gap is still uncomfortable. But the person who has practiced it for years meets it with something closer to equanimity than to dread. Not because it has stopped costing them, because they have become the kind of person who can afford to pay. True character building costs you the version of yourself that needed the world to cooperate. It costs you the comfort of performing rather than being. It costs you a certain kind of belonging, the easy belonging that comes from wanting what everyone around you wants and living how everyone around you lives. And it costs you daily the private small negotiations with your own standards that constitute the actual substance of the work. The Stoics did not ask whether any of this was fair. They noted simply that the alternative, a life without the examination, without the standard, without the daily confrontation with the gap, was a life lived in a kind of sleep. And a life in sleep, however comfortable, is not a life chosen. The cost of character building is real. So is the cost of not building it. The cost of character building is real. So is the cost of not building it. That is the sentence I hope stays with you, not as pressure, but as a genuine reckoning with what you are already paying, in one direction or the other, every day. If something in today's video landed with more weight than you expected, consider liking it, because honest conversations about what growth actually demands are rarer than conversations about what it promises. Every like helps that kind of thinking reach someone who is ready for it. And leave a comment. Write down one thing that genuine character building has already cost you, something you have given up or are in the process of giving up, because you have decided to hold a higher standard. Because the Stoics understood that naming the cost is the first step toward carrying it with intention rather than resentment. Subscribe to Logostoic and turn on notifications, because this is not a channel built for people who want to feel better about how they are already living. It is built for people who are willing to ask what living better actually requires. Well, keep asking together. May you pay the price with open eyes, and find, in the paying, that you have become someone who can.